speaking to you from Chatham House. My name is James Hanna. I'm the assistant head of the Asia program here. Today we'll be addressing the issue of the Korean Peninsula and specifically the topic of whether tensions are thawing on the Korean Peninsula. This comes after the recent talks between North and South with regard to the Winter Olympics. Our speaker today is Dr. John Nilsson-Wright. He's a senior research fellow with the Asia program here at Chatham House. He's also senior lecturer in Japanese politics and international relations at Cambridge University. The way that this will work is that we have about half an hour. John will speak for about 15 minutes and then we'll turn it over into a Q&A session. This event is on the record. Also, please, for those of you listening, participate and pay attention to the chat function in the bottom left corner of your screen. This is where you can submit your questions and also raise any technical issues if you're having them, which we will try to assist with if we can. With that, I mean, it's after a year in which tensions have risen markedly. You know, we are now in a position where some talks have happened. They've happened between the North and South rather than the US. There's been an element of sort of good cop and bad or even mad cop, depending on what you think with regards to Moon Jae-in and Donald Trump's approach to Kim Jong-un and Pyongyang. However, I won't waste more of your time. I will hand over to the speaker. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everybody. I suppose we should start by saying, you know, this looks like an important development in at least bilateral relations, so it's certainly an easing of tensions, given all of the uncertainty and anxiety associated with North Korea's actions last year. Why is this happening? Well, the proximate cause, the immediate cause, was, of course, Kim Jong-un's surprise announcement in his New Year's address that he was open to the idea of participating in the Winter Olympics, and from that we've had those two important bilateral talks between the two Koreas, you know, on January 9th and January 15th in Panmunjom. What does the agreement so far look like? The North has committed to send some 22 of its athletes to participate in the Games. It starts on February 9th. It will be limited participation, with North Korean athletes competing in ice hockey, figure skating, speed skating, cross-country skiing, and alpine skiing. I suppose symbolically what's important is that we will see both Koreas marching into the opening sessions, the opening ceremony of the Games, under a joint Korean flag, which is of course symbolically very important as a reflection of the aspirations of the two Koreas to resolve their differences. And also very importantly, the two Koreas will field, for the first time in an Olympic contest of any sort, a joint team, in this case, the joint women's ice hockey team. The two Koreas have competed before in the past, jointly, back in 1991. They fielded joint teams in table tennis and youth soccer, but this is the first time in the Olympics that we've seen the two Koreas agreeing to compete together. But it's more than just athletes. The North will also be sending to the South, as part of these Games, 140-strong popular orchestra. They will be sending some of their key musical celebrities, including a woman by the name of Hyun Song-wol, who is something of a media celebrity not only in North Korea but also in the South. Some of you may have seen the news coverage of her recent visit over the weekend to South Korea, where she was feted almost as something of a media celebrity by the South Korean public. We will also see the North Koreans send a demonstration team of some of their Taekwondo athletes, as well as a larger delegation of supporters and officials, some 230 altogether. And also, this is reciprocal. Not only will the North be sending athletes to South Korea, but also as part of the training preparations, we will have South Korean skiers traveling to North Korea to train in some of the ski resorts that the North provides. So it's a good example, if you like, of closer peninsular cooperation. Will it represent a decisive breakthrough in terms of the crisis on the peninsula? I think that's unlikely. President Trump, of course, has claimed with his characteristic bravado that it was his tough line that brought the two Koreas together. We've had some media reports that suggest this was an argument, or at least a point of view, that Trump put to President Moon some weeks ago in an effort to win, if you like, the public relations battle, presenting himself as the man who brought the two Koreas together. The evidence for that, I think, is open to question, and we can come back to that perhaps in the Q&A. President Moon himself, in acceding to that pressure from the US president to make that admission in public, is playing, I think, a long diplomatic game. What are his motives in terms of deciding to respond so positively to the overture from the North? Well, I think a number of factors. Moon himself, as a progressive president, as the heir to his political mentors, President Kim Dae-jung and after him President Roh Moo-hyun, is a man who is committed to the idea of engagement with North Korea. It's also something that matters to him at a very personal level. President Moon's family hails from North Korea, and therefore, from his perspective, anything that can be done to improve bilateral ties has to be seen as a positive development. And of course, this is all happening in the context where the fear of an escalation of tension on the Korean Peninsula, the threat of war breaking out between the United States and North Korea, is concentrating minds. We shouldn't forget that however close the United States and South Korea are as military allies, they have a different approach, or there are different nuances and emphases on the part of the two leaders. The South Koreans do indeed favor engagement and dialogue. And of course, even though President Trump has said that he is in principle willing to sit down and talk to Kim Jong-un, the primary focus on the part of the Americans seemed to be pressure in the form of economic sanctions, and ultimately and possibly the use of independent American military force against North Korea. And that's, of course, President Moon's biggest fear. And he has good reason to be anxious. We've seen in recent days and weeks statements from senior US officials, including National Security Advisor McMaster, and most recently, just yesterday, the CIA Director Mike Pompeo, in an interview with CBS, suggested that North Korea was just a few months away from acquiring the ability to put a nuclear warhead on a long-range missile and directly threaten the United States. That is seen by many in the United States as a decisive tipping point, at which point the United States may have limited options and may feel compelled unilaterally to take military action. The worry in South Korea, of course, is that despite the alliance relationship with the United States, Seoul doesn't really have the legal means to restrain the United States from going down that route if it chooses to. There's an argument, of course, that practically military action would have to involve South Korean military forces. Any conflict on the peninsula, most informed analysts argue, would involve a ground war, that surgical military strikes would not be sufficient to deal with the North Korean military challenge. And the argument, therefore, is that any decision on military force would have to involve cooperation between the United States and South Korea. But the worry on the part of President Moon is that he can't guarantee that that cooperation would be forthcoming. What about the motives of the North Koreans? Kim Jong-un, I think, again, it's very hard to be clear and unambiguous about this, but I think it's fair to say that he does see this as an opportunity to drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington, precisely because of those differences of nuance and emphasis that I mentioned earlier. He also wants to use the Olympics as an opportunity, at the very least, to delay the probability or possibility of military force being deployed by the Americans. He may also be hoping that this improved dialogue will open the way for a relaxation of economic sanctions. You'll recall that on December 22nd, the United Nations passed another resolution introducing yet tougher sanctions, sanctioning access to critical supplies of energy, particularly oil, for North Korea, as well as restricting the ability of North Korean workers to work overseas, shutting down possibilities of joint investment agreements between North Korea and foreign entities, and also targeting a range of senior members of the North Korean political leadership. If Kim Jong-un is hoping for a relaxation of those economic pressures, then I think he's going to be disappointed. But he can hope, I think, that this visit, and particularly the deployment of some of the North's athletes and some of its entertainers, will provide an opportunity for the North to secure something of a propaganda victory in South Korea by boosting the reputation of the country, by underlining its peaceful overtures, at least in the minds of some members of the South Korean public. The risks for President Moon, well, in the short term, I think they're relatively low. President Moon can be confident that his goal of securing a peace Olympics, as he's described it, will be realized, because by virtue of this agreement, he can be relatively confident that the North Koreans are unlikely to try and disrupt the games themselves. And of course, that represents a significant departure from past sporting activities. Cast your mind back to 1988, when South Korea hosted the Olympics for the first time, the regular Olympics as opposed to the Winter Olympics. And the North Korean position at that time was very different from today, with the North Koreans seeking to disrupt the Games. And very dramatically in 1987, just a year before those Games took place, engineering the attack and destruction of the South Korean airliner with a huge loss of life. The worry, I think, for President Moon is that some of the details of this agreement between the two Koreas may be affecting his popularity at home. Moon has enjoyed extraordinarily high levels of popularity in the 70s and 80% range since taking over as president in May. That popularity has dipped now to somewhere in the region of 67%. And there are some Koreans, particularly conservatives and the conservative media, who have criticized the president for reaching this agreement. There is criticism of the Blue House for agreeing to field a joint women's ice hockey team involving North and South Korean participants on grounds that this undermines the professional ambitions of the South Korean athletes, who will be forced to take something of a backseat to accommodate their North Korean counterparts. But I think on balance, Moon is likely to weather some of this criticism, partly because he has protected his right flank. Despite being a progressive president, since coming to power, he has also emphasized the importance of shoring up deterrence at home, making a commitment to increase South Korean defense spending, strengthening cooperation with the US military in terms of the deployment of US military assets to send clear signals to Pyongyang that any provocations from the North will be met with strong and decisive military responses. And of course, what we're likely to see once the Olympics are behind us is the restart of those critical joint exercises between South Korean and US forces, exercises that were temporarily suspended in response to the overture from North Korea. And that represents, I think, another demonstration of President Moon's diplomatic agility, not only reaching this agreement with the North, but persuading Donald Trump, at least temporarily, to suspend those joint exercises to make the collaboration between the two Koreas possible. I think if we look to the medium term, it's almost certain that we will see North Korea at some point after the Games restart its testing regime. Despite the very significant achievements it has reached last year, both that sixth nuclear test, which of course was a demonstration of the material advancements of the North Korean nuclear program, but also a series of decisive missile launches, the most dramatic being the launch of Hwasong-15 on November 29th. Despite all of those achievements, in order to develop a clear and demonstrable ability to strike the United States as a means of shoring up its deterrence capabilities, the North will need to keep testing to ensure that it can convince both itself and its potential adversaries that it can place a nuclear warhead and deliver it with pinpoint accuracy against the United States. In the face of that renewed testing, I think we will see the United States and South Korea remain relatively resolute. If there is to be any, if you like, division amongst the allies, at the moment, the most probable tension is between, in fact, Seoul and Tokyo. Quite separate from the Olympics, there is a difference of emphasis between the Japanese leader, Prime Minister Abe, and President Moon about the relative importance of engagement, the Japanese stressing the importance of maintaining the pressure on North Korea. And of course, we have very contentious historical issues, not least the question of so-called comfort women, in which recent announcements by the South Korean government have antagonized not only the Japanese government, but also public opinion in Tokyo. Looking ahead to the post-Olympic scenario, what can Donald Trump do in terms of trying to deal with the broader security tensions and the crisis over North Korea's nuclear assets? I suspect we will see more pressure, more attempt, as the United States has admitted in that important interview with Mike Pompeo, to use covert means, disruption, to try and slow down and retard the North Korean nuclear and missile testing program. Increased reliance on China to tighten sanctions, but I think there are very real limits on how far that can go, partly because the Chinese have their own reluctance to tighten the screw to a point where they create political momentum in North Korea that may be destabilizing. The Chinese view is that pressure is only going to be of limited effectiveness. And there, of course, is a very real important question about the effectiveness of sanctions to retard the North Korea's WMD program. We've already seen evidence of a certain porousness on the part of those sanctions, evidence of efforts by potentially China and also Russia, which has been singled out for criticism by Donald Trump for not enforcing those sanctions. The prognosis, I think, therefore, is that the Olympics represents a temporary lull in tensions. What we need, of course, and in a sense this echoes the position of President Moon, is more dialogue, more opportunities for serious discussions about a way out of the current stalemate. And for that, of course, we need to see clear evidence that the United States and North Korea are willing to talk. And so far, there has been no real credible evidence, despite Trump's public statements about a willingness to talk in principle, of any serious efforts at negotiations. In this context, I think, given the growing chorus of opinion in Washington to consider the military option, there is an onus on other countries, particularly in Europe, either privately or potentially publicly, to emphasize the danger of military escalation and to try and exercise a cautionary note. The danger of Trump's approach, in which he threatens military force, even if we see this as a so-called madman strategy, an attempt to use rhetorical brinkmanship to put pressure on North Korea, there is a danger that this will reinforce a growing confidence in Washington on the part of some observers that military force can be deployed with limited cost, that it may be possible to use military force in a way that doesn't expose South Korea to real serious risks of major retaliation from the North Koreans. I think that's hugely overconfident. And of course, the emphasis in South Korea through these new talks with North Korea is a reflection, I think, of those anxieties on the part of the South Koreans. So with that, I will stop here and be very happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, John. That's really good. I'll dive straight into the questions. I mean, you talked a bit about Moon Jae-in's agility, the suspension of joint exercises, but there is obviously this tension. There's this tension between the position in Seoul, which, as you say, is pro-engagement, and despite criticism, appears to still have fairly high majority support. At the same time, you have the fire and fury approach, the maximum pressure approach from the White House. So my question, part A, is, which you've partly addressed, is to what extent is there a joined up approach here? To what extent are the two working together to so to speak, sort of run a kind of pincer movement strategy? And a part of that, drawing on a question from Nick Flintoff, is what actually is the likelihood of a so-called bloody nose attack, whether covert or overt, I suppose? How likely is it that we will see US intervention?
It's very hard to say. We know that Donald Trump, I think, seems to have an appetite for military use of military force. So we know that there is a growing mood in Washington, I think, to argue that the military option needs to be considered not just as a diplomatic bargaining tool, as a means of putting pressure on the North, but because when we reach that tipping point, the United States will be seriously compromised. We've already had people like Senator Lindsey Graham saying in public that any American president, not just Donald Trump, would need to seriously entertain that option if the United States was credibly threatened by a nuclear North Korea. And in that context, South Korea would be reluctantly, as Graham presents it, a necessary casualty of that military action. We've also seen, I think worryingly, relatively unconvincing claims in the American media, including in the Washington Post, suggesting that it would in fact be possible to take out the North's military assets, its short-range artillery batteries just north of the DMZ, which are trained on Seoul and could create a huge amount of damage. But ultimately, most informed military observers have said very clearly that a war against North Korea would have to involve the deployment of ground forces. And that should be the one issue, I think, that gives America pause and gives Trump pause, because, of course, that would require not only US forces, but South Korean support, US forces deployed from Japan, and we would have to see a lot of advanced preparation, the movement and deployment of American forces to the region. It's why, again, to quote Senator Lindsey Graham, who on most national security issues is quite a sober, calm voice. The fact that he was willing to say not so long ago that it's time for unnecessary US personnel, dependents of military forces, to be redeployed out of the peninsula as a means of preparing for that possible military scenario. And so the moment we start seeing any evidence of that sort of development, then I think the level of anxiety goes up considerably, because it's a sign that the Americans might be contemplating the use of force.
Right. And in fact, I mean, if you it's under the proximity issue, and therefore the kind of the resultant devastating response from the north that is predicted if there is military intervention. In line with that, Ross Kent asked the question about whether this has been interpreted in many respects, these talks, as potentially a step change or a change of direction, to breathing space that's been widely called for, given the heightened tensions. But to what extent is this much more short term? To what extent is this South Korea trying to ensure that the Winter Olympics can take place without being rocked by interventions by the North?
Well, it's both, really. I mean, in the short term, of course, everybody wants to see these Olympics pass off successfully. It's an international event. It's not just a Korean event. President Moon, of course, has his own personal reasons to want to make sure this is a great success under his presidency. The simple basic reality is that anything that can be done to lower the level of tension on the peninsula is a good thing. And of course, the idea of dialogue between the two Koreas is at the heart of the Sunshine Plus policy of President Moon. It's very much consistent with his approach to diplomacy. One shouldn't forget, of course, it was candidate Moon during the presidential contest that followed the impeachment of President Moon's predecessor, Park Geun-hye. It was candidate Moon who said very clearly, I am prepared to go to Pyongyang. I am prepared to have my first overseas meeting with Kim Jong-un. Now, that, of course, hasn't happened. But maybe out of these discussions and dialogue, we can see the opportunity for further discussion and dialogue. It's quite striking, isn't it, that these talks in January follow on from the dramatic photographs and video imagery of North Korean soldiers defecting across the DMZ. The fact that in the face of what might have been seen in the North as a major political and diplomatic reverse, Kim Jong-un was willing to take this step in reaching out to South Korea has to be a welcome sign. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that Kim Jong-un is a rational actor. He knows that if military action were to take place on the Korean Peninsula, ultimately the Americans would prevail, although, of course, at a huge cost. And Kim Jong-un hopes that his WMD capabilities will give him the credible deterrent that will prevent the Americans from going down that route. The key is, how do we get to a point at which there are serious discussions in which the Americans and the international community can deliver results that at least give the international community some momentum in trying to slow down North Korea and ultimately reach a situation where the North Koreans' nuclear assets can be at the very least frozen, if not dismantled. For that to happen, we will have to have talks at some point. But for now, Kim Jong-un, I think, is capitalizing on the successes he's achieved already, and he will want more space for more testing to acquire that credible deterrent. And it's only at that point that the North Koreans have a real incentive to sit down and negotiate. Because, of course, Kim Jong-un's ambitions are not just to have a strong and credible deterrent, but also to deliver on his second promise to his people of providing economic growth. And to secure that, he needs relaxation of sanctions. So he has, I think, a two-stage strategy in mind. The Americans, of course, don't want to give him that extra time because they don't want to see him reach that critical tipping point.
Right. And I mean, I suppose in light of the previous question, I'll maybe turn that the other way around with the question from Edward Pandit, who asks what the prospects are for unification in the future. I mean, let's go the other way. Let's say this is the beginning of a turnaround. This is the beginning of a long process of negotiation that might lead to peace, might lead to Donald Trump winning the Nobel Peace Prize, but which might also lead to unification if that is the aim. So, do you think that there is any prospect, especially in light of Moon Jae-in's stated policy, for any kind of discussion or contemplation of a move towards an integrated Korea at this point?
Virtually zero. Extraordinarily unfortunately. Okay, miracles can happen, but I see no reason why the unification would be credible in the short term for all sorts of reasons. First, we have the nuclear standoff that has to be resolved before one could get to any serious discussion about unification. We would need the establishment of a credible peace regime, something that President Moon would like to see happen, but of course we're many steps away from that at this stage. Added to that is the fact that we have two very different regimes. Kim Jong-un, of course, only in power for the best part of 6 years with his own ambitions. He's not about to cede political authority to the South. And in South Korea, the appetite for unification is pretty low. The current generation of young Koreans don't share the views of the older generation that remembers the experience of the Korean War, and individuals who, like President Moon, of course, have family from North Korea. Younger voters in South Korea are more preoccupied with their own career ambitions, the desire to secure economic prosperity at home, and who see themselves first and foremost as South Koreans rather than as citizens of a unified Korea. The other problem, of course, with unification is that even if the political and diplomatic circumstances were to allow it to become part of serious negotiations, the practicalities of unification, certainly in terms of economic cost, provide a really powerful disincentive for the South Koreans to embrace what would be a huge bill, much, much bigger than the cost of German unification, as well as all of the added problems of how you bring these two separated peoples together, how do you maintain the security and economic well-being of South Korea in a post-unification scenario. So, no, I think it's as I say, virtually zero. As for Donald Trump winning the Nobel Peace Prize, it would certainly be a wonderful antidote to some of the worries that people have about his ambitions, but I think, again, that's extraordinarily unlikely.
Fair. I mean, to be fair, Adwait Pandit asked a two-part question, and I split it up intentionally because it runs into another question from Hamish Kinnear. Part one is, to what extent is North Korea legitimate and accepted as a country beyond doubt in the international community? To put Hamish Kinnear's bent on that, to what extent is the region preparing for the implications of a genuinely nuclear North Korea? They may Pyongyang may self-regard itself now after the sixth test as a nuclear weapons state, but obviously the position of the international community, certainly the position from Washington, is that this cannot be lived with. But so to what extent is North Korea accepted as a state, and to what extent is the region prepared to live with or preparing to try to deal with a nuclear North Korea?
I think this is a really important question because for the North Koreans, status and sovereignty really matter. International recognition as a legitimate actor on the international stage is key. But of course, all of these provocations from the North, both the nuclear tests and the missile tests, have undermined the credibility of that claim. And many countries, of course, are loath to give the North that degree of recognition. You ask about, if you like, de facto or perhaps de jure recognition of North Korea as a nuclear actor. That's, I think, impossible for lots of reasons. First of all, it would undermine the United States and the international efforts to limit nuclear proliferation, the knock-on effect in terms of spurring an accelerated arms race in the region, perhaps encouraging South Korea and Japan, particularly South Korea, where somewhere in the regions of 2/3 of the South Korean population support the idea of South Korea acquiring its own nuclear weapons. Those factors militate against any recognition of the North as a legitimate nuclear actor. And of course, for key states in the region, their relations with North Korea are already somewhat abnormal. Japan, of course, has yet to normalize relations with North Korea, despite having done the same with South Korea back in 1965. There are issues separate from nuclear question that bedeviled bilateral relations between Tokyo and Pyongyang, not least the experience of Japanese citizens who were abducted by North Korea, an issue that remains unresolved, and a long history of mutual resentment and antagonism between Japan and North Korea. So I think that that prospect of greater political recognition of the North is limited. However, it is something that can be dangled as a potential carrot. And the view, I think, on the part of the Blue House is that normalization of relations with North Korea, far short of any unification agenda, might be a useful way of incentivizing the North to come out from the strategic cold, if you like, to come in from the strategic cold and become more of a normal actor. To do that, we would have to have the beginning of talks of settlement for the Korean War, some sort of comprehensive peace treaty. But there are partial steps that could be offered if there was credible evidence that the North was serious about compromising. The establishment, for example, of formal diplomatic relations between the United States and North Korea, or at the very least the establishment of a liaison mission, if you like, a proto-embassy between an American embassy, if you like, in Pyongyang. Preliminary steps that might lead to that. The dispatch of a senior high-level US envoy with some political stature, because again, that would play into the sensibilities of the North Koreans, who again remain highly sensitive to the question of prestige and respect. And it could be part of a wider package. But again, the evidence suggests that the Trump administration is a long way from thinking of that as a possible option.
Right. And just to say, we're going to run on for an additional 5 minutes. One addition, I mean, you talked a bit during your presentation about the potential role for other powers, for other actors. And Kate Yarrington asked the question about what, if any, safeguards the international community could put in place to decrease the risk of a misunderstanding. And obviously, a lot of that stems from the dialogue, fire and fury, the dotard, the kind of back and forth of war of words that was particularly high in the summer and that has tailed off at the moment. But as you say, it may return, especially if DC continues to pursue a policy of maximum pressure. So what is possible for the international community with regard to trying to decrease the risk of misunderstanding, which obviously could have devastating consequences?
I think top of the priority list would be dialing back the rhetoric, avoiding some of the inflammatory statements that Donald Trump has engaged in, and for that matter, Kim Jong-un. But ratcheting up the rhetorical pressure and talking about the possibility of conflict, however much one might see the madman theory as having a kind of internal logic, I think is counterproductive. It raises the risk of conflict and creates this perhaps overconfidence in some circles in Washington that military action is in fact viable. And in order to reinforce that message, I think other international actors, leaders in Europe, for example, need to use public diplomacy as a means of reminding the Americans of the danger of this loose talk. Think back to the 1950s when, at the height of the Korean War, it was a British Prime Minister, of course, Clement Attlee, who got on a plane and flew to Washington, worried that the Americans were contemplating using nuclear weapons against North Korea, that helped in a limited way to lower the levels of tension on the Korean Peninsula. Europe can play a role in doing that. Other things that could be contemplated, well, I mean, there is this talk of a suspension for suspension deal that the Chinese have argued for, of stopping those joint military exercises as a means of sending a confidence signal to the North Koreans that there is an opening for dialogue and discussion. And of course, the Americans and the South Koreans have done just that in the context of the Olympics. If they were to do it again, might it persuade the North Koreans to be willing to sit down and talk? It's hard to say. There are things that could be done short of a full-blown suspension, of limiting US incursions into North Korean airspace, trying to reroute flight plans so that a cautious signal, if you like, is sent to the North Koreans that the Americans are militarily prepared with their South Korean allies to defend South Korea, but they will avoid unnecessary provocations. Beyond that, I suppose we can look at the re-establishment of the hotline between North and South Korea as creating at least a direct dialogue mechanism that is useful, at least in the event of a future escalation of tensions and the risk of a crisis through accident rather than design. There are limits to what can be done. We shouldn't forget, of course, that there have been past efforts. Back in 2007, it was late President Roh who in his summit meeting with Kim Jong-un was able to talk about, Kim Jong-il rather, was able to talk about new confidence building measures, particularly in areas where the two Koreas have been at heightened risk of conflict, particularly at sea near the so-called northern limit line. Now, there are mechanisms like that that could be deployed if we could envisage, for example, a summit between the two Korean leaders. That might open the door to further discussions. But we shouldn't forget that the route to a real peaceful resolution has to run through both Washington and Pyongyang. And that's why it's really critical on Donald Trump to think again about the possibility of talks with his North Korean counterpart, assuming Kim Jong-un were willing. And at this point, unfortunately, he doesn't show any sign of that.
John, that's a good ending point. Maybe it's not wholly positive. However, we'll just have to wait and see. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to address all of them. John, thanks once again. I think there are some details on the screen of upcoming webinars. Everybody, thank you very much. Have a great day. Thank you.